Imagine being locked in a small concrete box. The walls are white. The lights never turn off. You can't tell if it's day or night. You're alone. Completely alone. No phone. No TV. No books. No human touch. No conversation. Just you and four walls. Now imagine staying there for a day, then a week, then a month, then a year, then 10 years. This isn't a nightmare. This is real. And right now, as you watch this video, over 80,000 people are living this reality in America's prisons. Welcome to the hidden world of solitary confinement. If you want to discover the shocking truth about what really happens behind these walls, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below telling us, did you know solitary confinement existed in America? Let's get into this. Most people have never heard of ADX Florence. It sits in the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by beautiful scenery. From the outside, it looks almost peaceful, but the people inside call it something different. They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. They call it the cleanest hell on earth. Some just call it the place where souls go to die. ADX Florence is America's only federal supermax prison. Right now, it holds 380 men. But these aren't ordinary prison cells. A former warden named Robert Hood worked there. When he retired, he said something chilling. As soon as they come through the door, you see it in their faces. That's when it really hits you. You're looking at the beauty of the Rocky Mountains in the background. When you get inside, that is the last time you will ever see it. The supermax is life after death. Life after death. Think about those words. But here's what most people don't know. ADX Florence isn't the only place using solitary confinement. It's happening in prisons and jails across America. In fact, more than 120,000 people experience solitary confinement on any given day. That's enough people to fill a large stadium. And some of them, they haven't even been convicted of a crime yet. Let's talk about what solitary confinement actually looks like. This cell is small, really small, about 6 feet by 9 feet. That's roughly the size of a parking space. Some are even smaller. Inside there's a concrete bed, a toilet, a sink. That's it. The door is solid steel. There's no window to the outside world. Some cells have a small opening where guards pass food trays 3 times a day. In many places, the lights stay on 24 hours a day. Bright fluorescent lights that never turn off. A man who spent 4 years in one of these cells described it this way. My bed took up the length of the cell, and there was no other furniture at all. The walls were solid steel and painted all white. Due to the unchanging bright artificial lights and not having a wristwatch or clock, I couldn't tell if it was day or night. I would have believed it was a decade if that's what I was told. It seemed eternal and endless. People in solitary confinement spend 22 to 24 hours a day in these cells, alone every single day. Some get 1 hour outside their cell. But outside doesn't mean fresh air and sunshine. It usually means another small concrete room, sometimes with a high ceiling where you can see a tiny patch of sky. Sometimes not even that. There's no programming, no classes, no therapy, no visitors in many cases, just concrete, steel, and silence. Now, here's where things get strange. You might think, well, these must be the most dangerous criminals in America, right? The worst of the worst? That's what most people assume. But the truth is far more complicated. In 2024, the federal government released some shocking numbers. Out of all the people in federal prison, 7.7% are in restrictive housing. That's the official term for solitary confinement. That's over 11,000 people. But here's the twist. Studies show that about 1/3 of the men at ADX Florence have diagnosed mental illnesses. These aren't just violent criminals. Many are people with serious psychological problems who needed help, not isolation. And it gets stranger. Remember how I said over 120,000 people are in solitary on any given day? Well, between April 2024 and May 2025, More than 10,500 people were placed in solitary confinement in immigration detention centers. These are people waiting for their immigration cases to be decided. Many haven't committed any crime at all. So why are so many people being put in these boxes? The reasons vary. Sometimes it's for breaking prison rules. Sometimes it's for protective custody, meaning the prison claims they're protecting the person from other inmates. Sometimes it's because the person has a mental illness and the prison doesn't know what else to do with them. But here's what researchers discovered that shocked even them. Black men are placed in solitary confinement at dramatically higher rates than anyone else. In Pennsylvania, scientists studied everyone born between 1986 and 1989. What they found was disturbing. By age 32, 11% of all black men had been in solitary confinement. Compare that to 3.4% of Latino men and only 1.4% of white men. Let that sink in. Black men were 8 times more likely to experience solitary confinement than white men. A 2019 study found that black men made up 40.5% of men in prison overall, but 43% of those in solitary confinement. Black women? There were 21.5% of women in prison, but 42% of women in solitary. Scientists looked for evidence that black people commit more rule violations in prison. They found none. The difference wasn't in behavior. It was in how people were treated. Now we need to talk about what solitary confinement actually does to a person. And this is where the story takes a dark turn. Dr. Stuart Gratian was a psychiatrist who studied people in solitary confinement. What he discovered terrified him. He found that isolation does something to the human brain, something terrible. He called it shoe syndrome, named after the special housing units where solitary confinement happens. The symptoms include hallucinations, seeing and hearing things that aren't there, severe panic attacks, paranoia, believing everyone is out to get you, problems with thinking and memory, an inability to tolerate normal sounds, like water running through pipes. One person described it as your brain turning against you. But here's the truly horrifying part. Half of all suicides in American prisons happen in solitary confinement. Read that again. People in solitary make up only 6% to 8% of the prison population, but they account for 50% of suicides. And even if someone survives solitary confinement and gets released from prison, the nightmare doesn't end. Studies found that people who spent any time in solitary are 78% more likely to die by suicide in the first year after release. They're also 127% more likely to die from an opioid overdose in the first 2 weeks of freedom. Before we continue with what survivors have to say, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're uncovering truths that the system doesn't want you to know. Hit subscribe and comment below. Should solitary confinement be banned? We want to hear your thoughts. Let's hear from people who actually lived through this. A woman named Nicole Davis spent time in solitary. She described what happened to her mind. When you have no one to talk to inside a gray, dingy cell with its blacked-out window, you start talking to yourself. Then you think your inner self at least deserves an answer, so I began answering myself. I asked myself, what if I got swallowed into this black hole in my cell and just disappeared? The best way I can describe being in this small box when life is going on without you is, you are dead and the cell is your coffin. Think about that. She felt like she was already dead, like she was living in her own coffin. Another man named Thomas Whitaker spent more than 12 years in solitary on death row in Texas. His sentence was eventually changed to life in prison. He wrote about his experience. It's not always easy to see how this place creeps up on you. It twists you up in contradictions. I feel frayed, like I've been living in the face of this sandstorm for 11 years, and it's worn my soul down to a pathetic little nub. This place ruins people. Some it makes insane. Some, like me, it forces to go so deep that they aren't ever able to crawl back out again. Jack Powers, who was held at ADX Florence, put it simply, you're made to languish. You fall into certain types of despair when you're literally buried alive, when you're left 24/7 in a fairly small, concrete, steel cage, a sarcophagus underground, a sarcophagus, a coffin, the living dead. These aren't exaggerations. These are the actual words of people who survived. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part comes after release. A man known as Deuce spent 3 years in solitary confinement. When he finally got out and returned to his family, something was broken inside him. He said, "I couldn't be around my family. I just wasn't really ready for that kind of interaction. The anxiety that I would feel and that I still feel sometimes, and just trying to be around people, especially in public spaces, was incredibly difficult to deal with." Imagine that. 3 years in a box, and now he can't even hug his own family without feeling panic. A man named Daquan Peters, who spent about 10 years in solitary over his time in prison, said it simply, "For me, solitary confinement is mental torture. It's like murdering your soul." Scientists and doctors have studied solitary confinement for years, and what they've found is impossible to ignore. One major study looked at 5 different research projects on solitary confinement. They found that people in solitary showed significant psychological problems: depression, anxiety, psychotic symptoms, that means losing touch with reality, hostility and anger. And here's the key finding: these problems were beyond what normal prison causes. Even compared to people in regular prison cells, those in solitary were worse off. Another study tracked people in solitary and compared them to similar inmates in regular housing. The people in solitary had rates of serious mental illness that were sky high. They hurt themselves far more often. They ended up in mental health hospitals at much higher rates. The damage isn't just psychological either. Isolation causes physical health problems too. Doctors have documented vision loss, chronic pain, and fractures in people held in solitary confinement. Dr. Michael Zygmunt, a neuroscientist, explained it this way: "Isolation devastates the brain. There is no question about that. Without air, we will live minutes. Without water, we will live days. Without nutrition, we will live weeks. Without physical activity, our lives are decreased by years." Social interaction is part of these basic elements of life. Social interaction. It's not a luxury. It's a basic human need, like food and water. Here's something most Americans don't know. The rest of the world considers solitary confinement to be torture. The United Nations studied solitary confinement and came to a clear conclusion. They created rules called the Nelson Mandela Rules, named after the South African leader who spent 18 years in isolation during apartheid. These rules say that solitary confinement should never exceed 15 consecutive days. After 15 days, the psychological damage can become permanent. The former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture stated that keeping someone in solitary for more than 15 days should be absolutely prohibited based on scientific evidence. He noted that some psychological effects become irreversible after just 2 weeks. The international community has recognized this for years. But in America, people routinely spend months, years, even decades in solitary confinement. At ADX Florence, the average stay is measured in years, not days. So with all this evidence, with all these studies, with all these testimonies, what has the American prison system done about it? In 2014 and 2016, the federal government commissioned 2 major studies on solitary confinement. These studies made 87 recommendations for reform. Things like limiting the time people spend in isolation, providing better mental health care, creating alternatives for people with mental illness. As of 2024, the Bureau of Prisons has not fully implemented 54 of those 87 recommendations. That's more than half. And remember those numbers from earlier? The percentage of federal prisoners in restrictive housing is now at its highest level since 2008. The system isn't fixing the problem. In many ways, it's getting worse. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while the federal government has been slow to act, something surprising has been happening in individual states. something that challenges everything we think we know about prison safety and control. And that's where our story continues. In 2013, something unusual happened in the state of Colorado. The new director of corrections was a man named Rick Ramish. And on his first day on the job, he made a decision that would shock the entire prison system. He decided to spend a night in solitary confinement himself. 20 hours. That's all it was. Just one night in a concrete cell, alone, with the lights never turning off. When he came out, he was shaken. He said the experience was more difficult than he ever imagined. But here's what makes this story incredible. Ramish didn't just talk about how horrible it was. He actually did something about it. Colorado had one of the most notorious solitary confinement facilities in America, a place where 1,500 people were locked in isolation. Ramish looked at the evidence. He looked at the studies. He looked at the cost, both human and financial. And then he made a radical decision. Colorado would virtually eliminate long-term solitary confinement. People thought he was crazy. Prison officials warned him that violence would explode, that the prisons would become uncontrollable, that staff would get hurt, that inmates would run wild. But Ramish went ahead anyway. Over 6 years, Colorado reduced its solitary confinement population from 1,500 people to less than 5. You read that right. From 1,500 to less than 5. And here's the twist that nobody expected. Violence in Colorado prisons went down, not up. The biggest drop? Assaults on staff. The very people who were supposed to be protected by solitary confinement became safer when it was removed. The experiment worked. Colorado's success caught the attention of other states. If isolation wasn't necessary for safety, then what was it for? New York decided to try something too. In 2022, they passed a law called the HALT Act, which stands for Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement. The law said that nobody could be held in solitary for more than 15 consecutive days. It protected vulnerable people like the elderly and those with mental illness. The impact was massive. In February 2022, just before the law took effect, roughly 1,800 people were in solitary confinement in New York prisons. By September 2023, that number had dropped to about 300 people. That's more than an 80% reduction. But, and this is important, the implementation wasn't perfect. In 2024, investigators found something disturbing. They discovered that 40% of people were being held in solitary longer than the law allowed. Some were held for hundreds of days past the 15-day limit. In 24% of cases, people were being locked up without enough evidence that they'd actually broken any rules. The law was good, but the system was fighting back. Other states began passing their own reforms. Connecticut banned solitary beyond 15 consecutive days. New Jersey limited it to 20 days. Virginia agreed to end long-term solitary in its toughest prisons after a lawsuit. Even the federal government started paying attention. In 2024 and 2025, senators and representatives introduced bills to limit or ban solitary confinement in federal facilities. But here's the question nobody was asking yet. If solitary confinement is so harmful, and if prisons can be safe without it, then what should replace it? The answer would come from an unexpected place. Remember how I mentioned that about 1/3 of people in supermax prisons have mental illnesses? For years, the prison system's solution was simple. Lock them up alone. If someone was acting out because of psychological problems, put them in a box until they calmed down. But some prisons started trying something different. In New York City jails, they created special units called CAPS, Clinical Alternatives to Punitive Segregation. Instead of locking people with mental illness in isolation, they put them in units with therapy, individual counseling, group therapy, art therapy, medication management, community meetings. In other words, they treated mental illness like an illness, not like a crime. North Carolina tried something similar with units called TDUS, Therapeutic Diversion Units. They took people who would normally go to solitary confinement and put them in treatment programs instead. Then they studied what happened. The results were stunning. People in the therapeutic programs had significantly lower rates of rule violations. They ended up in mental health hospitals far less often. And here's the most important finding: they hurt themselves much less. How much less? People in solitary confinement had rates of self-harm that were 3.5 times higher than those in therapeutic units. They needed mental health hospitalization 4 times more often. The choice was clear. Treatment worked better than torture. But treatment costs more money. The therapeutic units are expensive to run. You need trained staff, therapists, programs, medical care, a concrete box with a steel door. That's cheap. And that might be the real reason solitary confinement continues. In 2024, something happened in a New York courtroom that sent shockwaves through the prison system. A man had spent 9 years in solitary confinement, 9 years of isolation, 9 years of concrete walls and fluorescent lights, 9 years of barely any human contact. He sued, claiming that 9 years in solitary confinement was cruel and unusual punishment, which is banned by the U.S. Constitution. The case went to trial. A jury heard the evidence. They heard from doctors and psychiatrists. They heard about the psychological damage. They saw the research, and they agreed. The jury found that 9 years of solitary confinement did indeed constitute cruel and unusual punishment. They awarded the man substantial damages. This was huge. For the first time, a jury had officially declared that long-term solitary confinement violated the Constitution. The case set a powerful legal precedent. It opened the door for other lawsuits. It gave hope to thousands of people still locked in isolation, but it also raised an uncomfortable question. If 9 years is cruel and unusual, what about 8 years? Or 5 years? Or 1 year? Where exactly is the line? Anthony Graves spent 16 years in solitary confinement for a crime he didn't commit. 16 years of isolation for something he never did. When DNA evidence finally proved his innocence, he was released. He could have walked away. He could have tried to forget and rebuild his life in peace. But instead, he became one of the loudest voices calling for an end to solitary confinement. Graves travels the country now, telling his story, speaking to lawmakers, testifying before Congress, fighting to make sure what happened to him doesn't happen to others. He's not alone. Survivors of solitary confinement have formed organizations. They write letters. They give interviews. They refuse to let America forget about the people still locked in boxes. Their message is simple. Solitary confinement breaks people. It doesn't rehabilitate them. It doesn't make them better. It makes them worse. And when these broken people are eventually released, and most of them will be released, they come back into our communities damaged, traumatized, and less able to function than before. We're not making society safer. We're making it more dangerous. If this documentary has opened your eyes to something you didn't know existed, do us a favor. Subscribe to this channel and share this video. Drop a comment telling us what shocked you most. The algorithm needs to see that people care about this issue. Help us spread the truth. Let's talk about money for a moment. Because beyond the moral arguments, beyond the human suffering, there's a financial reality that most people don't know about. Solitary confinement is expensive. Really expensive. Housing someone in a supermax facility like ADX Florence costs significantly more than housing them in a regular prison. The security requirements, the special construction, the staffing ratios, all of it adds up. But here's what's even more expensive: the lawsuits. Remember that 2024 case where the jury awarded damages for 9 years in solitary? That's not the only lawsuit. There are hundreds of cases working their way through the courts right now. People suing for the psychological damage caused by isolation. Families suing after loved ones died by suicide in solitary confinement. Every settlement, every jury award, every legal defense. That's taxpayer money. And then there's the cost after release. Remember those statistics about people who spent time in solitary being 78% more likely to die by suicide after release? Being 127% more likely to overdose? Every emergency room visit, every hospitalization, every death that could have been prevented. There's a cost to all of it. States like Colorado that eliminated solitary confinement aren't just doing it because it's the right thing to do. They're doing it because it makes financial sense. Therapy is cheaper than lawsuits. Treatment is cheaper than death. So where do things stand right now in 2026? The truth is complicated. On one hand, awareness is growing. More people know about solitary confinement than ever before. More states are passing reforms. More prisons are trying alternatives. But on the other hand, over 80,000 people are still in solitary confinement in America right now. Today, as you watch this video, the Federal Bureau of Prisons still hasn't implemented more than half of the recommendations from its own studies. Immigration detention facilities increased their use of solitary confinement dramatically in 2025. And here's something that should worry everyone. The vast majority of people currently in solitary confinement will eventually be released. They'll walk out of those concrete boxes and back into society. Some will move into your neighborhood. Some will live on your street. And they'll be carrying the psychological scars of isolation with them. Studies show that people released from solitary confinement have higher rates of reoffending. They struggle to hold jobs. They have trouble maintaining relationships. They're more likely to end up homeless. We're taking people, locking them in boxes until their minds break, and then releasing them into the world and expecting them to function normally. It doesn't work. So what's the solution? Based on everything we've learned, the answer seems clear. Some experts say solitary confinement should be banned entirely, except in the most extreme circumstances. And even then, only for a few hours or days, never weeks, months, or years. For people with mental illness, the solution is treatment, not isolation. Therapeutic units, counseling, medication, programs that actually address the underlying problems. For people who pose a genuine safety risk, there are alternatives. Special units where people can have more space, more time out of their cells, and more interaction with staff and other inmates under controlled conditions. Colorado proved it can work. New York proved the numbers will drop dramatically with the right laws. But it requires something difficult. It requires us to see prisoners as human beings, not as monsters who deserve whatever suffering we can inflict, but as people who made mistakes, who have problems, who are still capable of change. Some people will read that and think it's too soft, that criminals deserve to suffer. That isolation is just punishment for bad behavior. But remember, half of all suicides in prison happen in solitary confinement. People who spend time in solitary are much more likely to die in the first year after release. This isn't about being soft on crime. This is about not driving people insane and then releasing them into our communities. This is about recognizing that torture doesn't make anyone safer. We started this documentary by asking you to imagine being locked in a small concrete box, alone for days, months, years. Now you know the truth. It's not just happening. It's happening to over 80,000 people in America right now. You know that it causes severe psychological damage, that it drives people to suicide at catastrophic rates, that it disproportionately affects Black and Latino people, that the international community considers it torture. You know that alternatives exist, that they work, that prisons can be safer without solitary confinement. You know that some states are making changes, but you also know that the federal government has been slow to act, that many prisons are resisting reform, that people are still being held in isolation for years, sometimes decades. The question now is, what happens next? Will America continue using a practice that the rest of the world calls torture? Or will we follow the evidence and the examples of states like Colorado and New York? The answer depends partly on awareness, on whether people like you know this is happening and care enough to demand change. Because here's the final truth. This isn't happening in some distant country. This is happening in America, in your state, paid for with your tax dollars. And the people locked in those boxes today, many of them will be your neighbors tomorrow. The choice is ours. Continue breaking human beings in concrete boxes, or find better ways to keep our communities safe while treating people with the basic dignity that every human deserves. The evidence is clear. The solution is possible. The question is whether we have the courage to change. That's the truth about solitary confinement inside America's toughest prisons.